Hi everyone! Just before I start, I'd like to thank the organisers of CRE 2022 for putting this conference together. They've done a really great job and I'm really gutted I can't be there in person. So my talk today is on why changes in the development of Egyptian verbal constructions occurred in a cyclical pattern. So first, for anyone who's not familiar with the full development of the ancient Egyptian language, I'll start with a quick overview. Ancient Egyptian is the world's oldest and longest continually attested language. It's attested for around 5,000 years from the earliest known hieroglyphs and has around 4,000 years history of complex grammatical development. So from when full sentences started being written rather than things just like a noun on its own. And this development ended as the use of the language died out and no new texts were being created, although existing texts continued to be copied. This time has been separated into 5 broad stages: Old, Middle and Late Egyptian, and Demotic and Coptic. Throughout this time, both between language stages, but also within each language stage, each verbal construction, which is the focus of my research, experienced a number of linguistic changes. As a result of the individual linguistic changes they experienced, each Egyptian verbal construction shows an overarching pattern known as the linguistic cycle pattern. This is a theoretical linguistic pattern which involves the alternation between analytic and synthetic forms, with a full cycle being the change from analytic to synthetic to analytic, or alternatively from synthetic to analytic to synthetic. And to define synthetic and analytic in a linguistic context, Schwegler has given the definition of synthetic as the interdependency of morphemes within a speech unit, and analytic as the autonomy of morphemes within a speech unit. Although at a slightly more basic level, what this essentially means is that a synthetic form would use one word, where an analytic form would use several, which you can see here in the difference between the synthetic ancient Greek form palso, which uses one word, and its English equivalent, I am going to stop, which uses 5. So synthetic forms use less elements here referring to morphemes or words, and are less separable, whereas more analytic forms use more elements which can be separated by other words. So we can visualize this cycle something like this, with the process of a construction becoming more analytic called analyticization, and the process of a construction becoming more synthetic being syntheticization. So it's already been noted that Egyptian shows a particularly striking example of the linguistic cycle pattern, especially in comparison to other languages. The fact that the developments of Egyptian verbal constructions exhibit the linguistic cycle pattern has been noted since at least 1970 from a rather brief article by Hodge. And as I already mentioned, the linguistic cycle is visible in the development of each and every verbal construction I've looked at, which is every verbal construction attested across multiple language stages, and that's 17 constructions in total. In the majority of cases, the linguistic cycle involved one repetition, with the development from synthetic to analytic to synthetic. A few constructions show a more extended version of the linguistic cycle. These are the negative habitual, negative future, and perfect constructions, which each have an additional analytic stage in their development, and the past construction, which has both an extra analytic stage and an extra synthetic stage. So the linguistic cycle as a pattern was created through the occurrence of several processes of linguistic change, which either caused an increase in analyticity or an increase in syntheticity. The 3 processes which can be seen in every verbal construction are auxiliarification, which involves the addition and grammaticalization of an auxiliary from either a preposition or verbal source. This was the most common process involved in analyticization, with the additional auxiliary increasing the quantity of elements and consequently the analyticity of the construction. There's also erosion, which involved reduction of phonological form, and coalescence, which joined together elements which were previously separable. So something external to the construction which could have previously been placed between them now couldn't. These both increase syntheticity of a construction, either by making it shorter or making it less separable, and they both occurred in the developments of all verbal constructions. There are also a few other linguistic changes involved in forming the linguistic cycle pattern in various constructions, but these are all less common than the 3 main processes. For analyticization, most of these involved the addition of something new into the construction, either the verb ending "n", a second negative marker, something which expanded semantic markers, or an extra way of expressing the subject. The only process involved in analyticization which didn't involve the addition of a new element was the reanalysis of one element as two. Each of these processes occurred in between 1 and 3 constructions. For syntheticization, the other process involved was loss, which involved the elimination of an element of the construction, eventually resulting in its being permanently absent from the construction. For Egyptian, this definitely refers to the absence of an element from the orthographic written form of a construction, but this doesn't necessitate its absence from the spoken form, and there may have been elements lost in speech, but not in writing, and we can't see this from the written evidence that we have. Loss definitely occurred in the developments of 9 constructions, so about half the constructions I looked at. So for a quick illustration of the linguistic cycle and the main processes involved in creating it, here's the causative infinitive construction. Here we can see analyticization caused by the auxiliarification of "er", which caused an increase in the quantity of elements of the construction, and then syntheticization through the slight erosion of "d" and "er", which made these phonologically shorter, and the coalescence of "d" to "er" and of the content verb to the rest of the construction. So that's a very quick summary of the linguistic cycle in Egyptian verbal constructions. But the main question today is why this cycle developed at all. We can look at this from a couple of different perspectives. So we can look at this question from a broader, somewhat more theoretical perspective as to why language users might want or need to use increasingly more analytic and then increasingly more synthetic language. Or we can look in a slightly narrower perspective at the individual processes that form the linguistic cycle pattern using empirical and language-specific evidence. So starting with the broader perspective then, there are a few linguistic theories which may help explain why the linguistic cycle might have developed, but the main one I'm going to focus on today is the invisible hand theory, first put forward by Keller and supported by Haspelmath. This involves the hypermaxim that language users should talk in such a way that they are socially successful at the lowest possible cost, which is achieved by adhering to the maxims of clarity, to talk in such a way that you are understood, extravagance, to talk in such a way that you are noticed, economy, to talk in such a way that you do not expend superfluous energy, and conformity, to talk like other language users do. Of these, the ideas of clarity and extravagance cause a speaker to use a new innovative construction to express a meaning which has previously been expressed using a different form. For example, in the Egyptian future construction, the future Sejem was replaced by the third future Euf Sejem. The new form is often a periphrastic form, so expresses meaning through a combination of words rather than inflection, and the new form is more analytic than the older form it replaces, as we can see in this example of the Egyptian future. Innovations like this begin with a single speaker and then spread to other language users. Initially, this follows the maxim of extravagance, as the new form is still unusual, but also the maxim of conformity, as the people who start using the new form are speaking like the original innovator of the form. As the new form spread further, it is not extravagant anymore, and its continued spread is only following the maxim of conformity. As the frequency of the new construction increases in this way, language users are able to conform to the maxim of economy using a reduced pronunciation of the construction, which makes it more synthetic, and it's able to be done since the risk of being misunderstood is reasonably low. And this reduced pronunciation then again spreads due to the maxim of conformity. And one particularly clear example from Egyptian is in the conjunctive construction, where the auxiliary M2 was reduced to N. So in relation to the linguistic cycle pattern, the maxims of extravagance and clarity can provide an explanation for analyticization, with the development of more analytic forms coming from the need and desire of language users to use a form which is more extravagant and or clearer than the existing form. The maxim of economy can provide an explanation for syntheticization, with the use of reduced pronunciations that expend less energy, resulting in forms that are more synthetic than their predecessors. The maxim of conformity then ensures that these more analytic forms and more synthetic forms are spread across language users. Any attempt by language users to achieve this hypermaxim of speaking socially successfully at the lowest possible cost creates a paradox, which then leads to a cyclical pattern. To be socially successful, you want to be speaking extravagantly, so you're noticed, and clearly, so that you're understood. And to speak at the lowest possible cost, you want to be speaking as economically as possible, with a pronunciation which is as reduced as possible. But these are in opposition, as the most reduced pronunciation is neither clear nor extravagant, and the clearest or most extravagant ways of speaking are not economical. So the constant attempt to speak both as clearly or extravagantly and as economically as possible leads to alternating priorities, which leads to the alternation between analytic and synthetic forms. If a meaning is expressed with a particularly economic form, which is synthetic, language users feel the need to replace it with a clearer or more extravagant form to be socially successful, either to ensure that they are understood or to be noticed. In order to be clearer or more extravagant, this new form contains more words or morphemes, and is consequently more analytic than the previous form of the construction. Then, as the new form becomes more commonly used, so it's no longer extravagant, and there are no clarity issues or risk of being misunderstood, speakers will then work towards the lowest possible cost part of the hypermaxim, making the construction more economic by running words together, making the pronunciation of words shorter, or missing out phonemes or morphemes altogether, each of which makes the construction more synthetic. So this cyclical development between increases in analyticity and increases in syntheticity, which forms a linguistic cycle, can be considered from a broad perspective to be due to the alternating priorities of language users to be either as clear and extravagant or as economic as possible, as they attempt to communicate in a socially successful way at the lowest possible cost. Moving on to look at some of the individual linguistic processes which help form the linguistic cycle, and starting with the analyticization stages. As I said earlier, the main cause of analyticization in Egyptian verbal constructions was auxiliarification, in which a verb or preposition was added to the construction and reanalyzed as an auxiliary. Just to illustrate this at the bottom here, we have the past construction, where auxiliarification involved ir being added to the construction. This came from the verb iri, to do, which was then reanalyzed as past auxiliary, experiencing desemanticization, through which it lost its lexical meaning of to do and was left only with its grammatical meaning of past tense. It's likely that causes of analyticization in Egyptian verbal constructions were linked to frequency of use. As you can see from the approximate dates of auxiliarification for each construction, most of the constructions with the most basic meanings and which we use most frequently, so the negative past, present, future, and negative future, first experienced auxiliarification sometime before most other constructions. These are also the constructions which had the most reduced forms in early Old Egyptian. So the present and future both used sejameth, and the three negative constructions were all formed en sejameth in their earliest attested forms. So even taking into account any different vowels that they may have used, there's still serious potential for confusion between these constructions, which may have motivated the need for a clearer distinction using new forms with auxiliaries. We do have the outlier of the past construction, which was very frequently used and also used the form sejameth in its earliest attestation, but its form with an auxiliary is not attested until late Egyptian and did not become the most common form of the construction until late Demotic. However, this construction did begin to use the form eu sejamaneth in the 5th dynasty, so it's possible that this was considered enough to distinguish this construction, and it didn't need a new form with an auxiliary until it started using sejameth as the most common form again in early late Egyptian. The constructions which had more niche meanings and which were less commonly used typically experienced auxiliarification much later in the history of the Egyptian language. It's likely that this was caused, at least in part, by analogy. Analogy is the process of spread across the linguistic system, and it's quite possible that the use of auxiliaries spread from their use in more common verbal constructions to the less frequently used constructions. The causes for one of the main processes involved in syntheticization, erosion, may also be attributed to frequency. Erosion involved reduction of phonological form, which is not always visible in writing, but can be seen at least once in each Egyptian verbal construction. For example, in the terminative construction, we see the erosion of R to E, and similarly in the future construction of R to F. It's been established that linguistic items, which have a high frequency of use, are shorter than low frequency items. And also the grammatical items, such as the fixed elements within verbal constructions, have a higher frequency of use than lexical items. In Egyptian verbal constructions, we see the process of a lexical item becoming more grammatical in auxiliarification, and this grammaticalization increased the frequency of the item. And given that higher frequency items are shorter, it follows that as a lexical item, which has lower frequency, is grammaticalized into a grammatical item, which has higher frequency, it becomes shorter and phonologically reduced through erosion. Using the example of the erosion of R to E in the future construction again, when it enters the construction in Old Egyptian, R is lexical. It's a preposition meaning towards. But over time, it loses this lexical meaning and gains the grammatical meaning of future tense. And it's only after this that it experiences erosion, probably by someone around Late Egyptian. Although we can't see this for sure from the written evidence, but given the increasingly regular emission of R from this construction in Late Egyptian in writing, and its writing as the vowel A in Coptic, we can assume that R has been phonologically reduced to a vowel by Late Egyptian, and is thus being often omitted in writing due to the use of scripts which don't write vowels. Rather related to this cause of increasing frequency is the quantity principle, which states that a larger chunk of information will require a larger chunk of code. This again leads to the idea that lexical items, which hold larger chunks of information, are greater in size than grammatical items, which hold smaller chunks of information. And that as a lexical item becomes more grammatical, it will be eroded to reduce the size of its code, reflecting the reduction in its information value. This suggests that erosion may be caused by the process of desemanticization, which is a linguistic shift involving loss of lexical meaning and the gaining of grammatical meaning. This process of desemanticization occurred before erosion in all Egyptian verbal constructions. Desemanticization may also be seen as a cause for the other main syntheticization process, coalescence, which involves the joining of two or more elements which could be previously separated by something outside of the construction. Every Egyptian verbal construction shows the results of coalescence within their written form in early Coptic, although the negative, past, and terminative constructions each also exhibit evidence of another instance of coalescence earlier, in early Late Egyptian and late Egyptian respectively. So this already shows that coalescence generally happened quite late in the development of each construction, after other linguistic processes had occurred. Cross-linguistic studies have shown that coalescence often occurs after and due to phonological and semantic reductions. In Egyptian verbal constructions, the form of each construction which first shows evidence of coalescence is often the form which also first shows evidence of erosion, although this may have occurred earlier in the spoken language, with it taking some time for these changes to be reflected in the written language. But in terms of semantic reduction, it's clear that in every construction that desemanticization had occurred before coalescence, and thus was likely a cause of coalescence. So to answer the question, why did the Egyptian language develop in cycles? From a broader perspective, this cyclical pattern can be viewed as the results of language users' attempts to communicate in a way that is socially successful at the lowest possible cost, with their priorities alternating between speaking more clearly or extravagantly and speaking more economically. We can also look at the causes of individual linguistic processes which contributed to either the analyticization or syntheticization stages of the linguistic cycle. The causes for these are often linked to the high frequency of use of grammatical forms, such as the verbal constructions considered here. Auxiliarification, which was involved in analyticization in every construction, may have been caused by the potential for confusion between existing forms of constructions, creating a need for greater clarity, particularly among the most frequently used constructions, for the use of auxiliaries then spreading across other more niche constructions through analogy. And the main syntheticization processes, erosion and coalescence, were likely caused by the earlier occurrence of desemanticization within the development of a construction, as occurred in every Egyptian verbal construction. Thank you for listening, and if anyone wants to contact me with any questions, these are my details.